Hi, Pallavi. Thank you for giving us your time today. Uh, could you start with a little introduction? Maybe we could start a bit with a bit of your childhood to how you ended up becoming a journalist to your journalistic career till now.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Vivek. Thank you for inviting me for your podcast. And I would love to. Essentially, I grew up an army kid. My dad was in the armed forces. I spent most of my life in the Northeast, which meant that a lot of, so I didn't grow up with a lot of information. Like, I didn't have access to satellite TV or internet, and until I was in class 10th or 11th when my dad took retirement. Even when news used to come, it used to reach us in the cantonment 2 days later. So I've always grown up in this world of in this very isolated sort of life, and where news is always delayed. But that's not what got me into journalism. I was essentially really interested in writing, and I love writing. I love reading, and journalism was one way to explore that passion. So that's how I found myself as a journalist. I have a background in humanities. I have a graduation in history honors from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. Then I did a 1-year postgraduate course in print journalism from Asian College of Journalism. So I guess a journalism degree gave me some sort of a structure when it comes to writing, and also collecting stories, because writing is great, but what do you write about? And then this is also the time when social media wasn't a big thing. Now everyone is a writer on social media. Anyone can do anything right now. It's very easy to get published. But at that point, in 2011, it's not that long ago, but it feels really long ago. But having a byline was a really big thing. I started off as a print journalist with the Indian Express. I was with them for 7 years. I was based in Delhi. I started off with covering arts and culture, and then I moved to doing long form news features for the weekend section. From there, I had some love for long form. So I also joined Open Magazine for a while. I did a lot of long form news features for them. I traveled a lot in that very short stint. And I did some really interesting stories. For example, I went to Kargil and did this bit about their cultural renaissance started by young people who wanted people to see Kargil in a different light rather than as a former war zone. Then very briefly, I joined Condé Nast International as their features editor. And I used to write on art, design, and architecture. And after that, I joined Vice News, and for 5 years, I was with Vice News covering South Asia. So that's a brief background of everything I've done.
One of your earlier articles was about the Garhwali culture, and I think that's where you're from, and how it's a dying culture. And also, you also mentioned about how you have also stopped sort of identifying with it or sort of resonating with it. I also, in fact, experience a bit of this alienation from my own sort of culture. Not completely, but in some parts. Do you feel like a stranger to your own culture?
I mean, I was a little surprised. I thought, Mallus have a stronger sense of community. For example,
Yes, but I'm not a born and brought up Mallu.
Right. I guess I understand that sense of alienation, and from your own culture. So I'm from Dehradun, and my mom is a Garhwali, and she speaks Garhwali. From my mom's side, everyone speaks Garhwali, but culturally, even in the hills where people speak Garhwali, because of modernity and all, a lot of people associate Garhwali language, with a little bit of shame, and with this thing that, who speaks Garhwali these days? And which is sad, because until I wrote that article, I honestly didn't know that Garhwali was actually dying out, or is under threat of dying out. So I started thinking more deeply about it. And also, like, it's not just like, like the language, like Garhwali, a culture also has like more than just language. It's, like it's food, it's like small things that make up a culture. And like my mom has always been really conscious about like Garhwali as a language. Like it was also like this, like secret language in our house, in my Nana's house, for example, where all like she and her sisters used to like gossip in Garhwali so that nobody else can like understand. So there was always like this fun part of it. But yeah, like I do get that alienation. I think like unlike most communities like Bengalis, for example, or even like like Malayalis, Garhwalis, like if Garhwalis find each other in like a city, we don't feel that sense of bonding because we are like, we haven't bonded with our own culture. So, like even if we meet like a fellow Garhwali, we're just like, oh, okay, you're a Garhwali. Okay, so am I. Okay, that's it. Like, we have nothing in common because we never bother to like learn our language. So I feel like if we, like, as in like if my generation and the ones that are like coming after us, like if we would bother to like learn our language, I mean, there is so much in Garhwali culture, literature, music, folklore, like there is so much that can bond us. And I see a lot of like these startups and like the, like the hospitality business that's moving to Uttarakhand and, like representing like local Uttarakhandi food and culture and traditions. And it's sad to see that, like it's interesting just as a product, as something that is being sold and not as something that, like people would like to own or people are proud of. Like, so I guess like, yeah, my alienation comes from like different ways. But yeah, like when I wrote that article, I was feeling it specially, like because I was like media as an industry, like it is dominated by certain communities. And that made me think that, like, oh, where do I come from? Like that sense of belonging, that sense of identity. I guess like it's a longer process, but yeah, being in the media industry also like made me think a little bit about that. And obviously like I had to write about it.
What's your journalistic process? Do you have any process that you have carved out over time?
So, I mean, like for any journalist who works as like a full-time employee with a news organization, unfortunately, they are like a bit of slave to the news cycle. So, like we are, like sort of, we get FOMO when we don't respond to like certain like like breaking news, for example. So there is that. But for me, what I find interesting is the intersectionality in news. For example, like if there's a breaking news, I look at, for example, like impact on women, like through like, like in that happening. So, a lot of journalists, like we're all very used to like going to the spot and like interviewing people. My over the years, as in like like I've also grown up responding to like breaking news. Like it's usually like a most basic way to like start your journey in like journalism. But over the years, what I've practiced is like FOMO often like gets one to the spot, and like it's all like fun and a lot of adrenaline. Like reporting on all of that, reporting on like ground stuff that's happening when a news breaks. But over the years, I've realized that, like sometimes it's just better. Like the stories are more wholesome when you like wait for the news to happen, take a step back and look at the larger picture. And over the last 5 years, working with an international organization especially helped me do that. Like it made me, it allowed me to like step back and look at the news in the sense that, like how it impacts or like why would it be relevant to a global audience, like more than just a regional issue, more than just a local issue. And India is, like one of the most, I mean, it's a developing economy. It is, like the most populated country in the world right now. India's politics matters. Like what's happening in India matters across the world. Whatever happens in India, there is response from across the world. So, like the last 5 years, I've learned to, like sort of step back and look at how that news is relevant for a global audience. I'm very grateful that I've had the opportunity to do that because, I mean, in journalism, a lot of journalists get stuck reporting, like beat reporting or like daily news reporting, which is great training, by the way. It's great training. Like it gets you like sources in unconventional ways, and like it gets you great stories. But like to me, I've really, since I love writing, like I guess like in journalism you find like three kind of like journalists. You get like a person who's a great reporter but not that great a writer, somebody who's a great writer but not that great a reporter, and like somebody who's like both. So those are like ideal sort of journalists. And I would admit, like, I'm more of a writer than a reporter. I love reporting, but I also look at stories beyond just the news. So, like if I would go and report, for example, I went and I was in UP early this year, sometime in January or January. Yeah, I was in January in UP. And I decided to follow a story of essentially people being declared dead on paper while they're still alive. And there are like different reasons for it. It's been reported on, like in isolation, this trend has been reported on like people being declared dead while they're still alive by their relatives or like some like official who has like some ulterior motive and all. But I took a step back and, like I was able to identify why that happens. Like land is of really high demand in India. There are like people commit murders because they want land. And India is an economy with an exploding population. And I decided to look at, like the intersection of caste, gender, and yeah, like it's essentially like I decided to look at like where it's happening. So yeah, I guess like that's my process, like just like zooming out and looking at the larger picture. And I like, like putting stories. I mean, like when I interview, I don't just like ask like these 5 questions that would be the most relevant to the story. I love asking them like random questions that, like, oh, that day when this happened, what were you doing and what was cooking in the kitchen? Like just like really basic details if they can remember. And most of the time, I just, like sit there, because in journalism, you also see like this trend of like journalists talking over subjects. And like in the last 10, 12 years of my reporting, I've realized that if you just like stand in front of people and just like let them talk, they say a lot more like than the amount that they would if you ask them like these 5 very basic questions. So I just let people talk, like their hearts out. And yeah, that's mostly my process. And I love writing, so I love creating a narrative out of it.
Do journalists also get FOMO?
All the time, or can't take a break. I know journalists who have not taken breaks in years. I mean, when I started journalism, I didn't take a proper holiday until, I don't know, 5, 6 years later. I was just, and even if I'm like, if it's my off and like a news breaks, like there's this anxiety, oh my God, I'm missing this news. So yeah, so journalists, I think like they are journalists because they have FOMO. Everyone wants to be on the spot, like they want to be the first people on the spot. And I guess it's also like this is the nature of the beast as well, like this competition, this, like obsession to be the first to break the news. But like eventually what readers or what audiences want is, like, I mean, yeah, there is like we need journalists who cover like spot news and stuff, but we also need journalists who give readers and audiences like a bigger picture. And I mean, like I am a big consumer of big picture stories, so like I have like sort of consciously shifted away from like this FOMO driven reporting to long form stuff.
How different is it to be a journalist in India versus the rest of South Asia?
I mean, like, like from a broader picture, from, like a global media point of view, South Asia, like apart from India is like really well represented in global media. But the rest of South Asia, not so much. Like Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, there is a certain perception in the Western media about what kind of stories work, like for the Western audience mostly, from these regions. So like for me, like I have mostly reported from India, like being based in India. Over the last 1 year, I had the opportunity to be based out of Southeast Asia. I did some stories from Southeast Asia, not many. But yeah, I did like a few stories from Indonesia. But I've had the opportunity to, like be outside of South Asia and report on South Asia from, like the outside. And that was really beneficial because that made me look at media representation of South Asia. And I found that the world is definitely obsessed with India for like many reasons and well deserved also. Like India's economy is like doing pretty, by global standard, it's doing pretty well. Some of the richest in the world are Indians. Some of the leading tech CEOs are Indians. Like there are like governments, there are like world leaders who are of Indian or like Pakistani origin. So, like South Asians are having quite the moment on the global stage. But at the same time, like South Asia is represented with a certain bias. So, like being outside of South Asia helped me gain that perspective. And, like I also like, it also allowed me to like do my do my reporting to challenge those biased notions. For example, in India, we cover a lot of like sexual violence, but we don't hold the powerful accountable. When I covered the story in UP, I like made sure that I like it's like a very basic thing to do in journalism, but like you call up the government and you hold them accountable. Like how can this slip away? How can like communities slip through the cracks? When I went to the Himalayas to cover the land subsidence in Joshimath, like early this year, when that whole news broke about like houses sinking into the ground, like we had the opportunity to talk about the massive development, like the $1 million development projects in the Himalayas, like across Uttarakhand. That's like causing like major damage to the very like fragile ecosystem of the Himalayas. And Indian Himalayas is the most fragile ecosystem in the world. So being outside of South Asia made me gain perspective. And there is a lot of human rights reporting in South Asia by journalists. But what we don't do is, like holding the powerful accountable. Like that needs to happen in equal measure. And there are like a bunch of independent news outlets who do that. Like they do incredible work, like Morning Context, Article 14, Scroll, these, like independent media organizations. They're doing some amazing nuanced stories from across India to hold the powerful accountable. So I think like in terms of that, like we need to like not just challenge this bias in representation of South Asian stories, but we also like need to change the system, like change the way we report in South Asia, which is, like not through like poverty porn or like putting the burden of stories on the affected communities. Like we need to start focusing way more on those in power.
So your profile on Twitter says that you cover topics that intersect tech, society, politics, and gender. I understand tech and society, but I would like to understand more about politics, this intersection between politics and gender. Where do you think politics and gender intersect? And how did you get here?
I mean, as a woman growing up in India, although with like a fair bit of privilege, I think like a lot of women grow up with this, like knowledge and also the sentiment of how striking and deeply inherent gender gap is in India, like in terms of political participation and representation. And what I really love about the media industry, to be honest, is that especially the organizations where I've worked, is that a lot of journalists are women. Like, so journalism also, like comes with its own representation problem. It also comes with its own inherent biases. It is still a male-dominated space. I mean, there is a fair bit of like women representation, but it is still a male-dominated space in the sense that a lot of executive or top management roles are still men, like they're not women. So I think like I joined journalism at a time where women have been entering, or like women are in a position of power, and in a country where like there is so much gender gap. So I got interested in like covering gender in South Asia, because like as a woman, I see these biases everywhere, whether like be it out in news or in my own newsroom. Like I have to acknowledge that there is a fair bit of bias within newsrooms. Like I have dealt with the pay gap as a woman in India, like in an Indian newsroom. So anyway, like politics plays a major role in all our lives. So I was interested in, like not just like political representation of women, but also, like participation. And in India, like whatever happens, like if a news breaks, if there's an affected community, any adverse event disproportionately impacts women. So that's where my focus comes, like when it comes to like gender representation in my stories. And uh like there's like this famous statement, like personal is political. And yep, I mean, like I just apply that principle in my reporting. Like just as women, a lot of their personal choices, a lot of their existence is by default political. So yeah, so I just like, yeah, so the reason why I chose to add that in my bio is that, like I look at stories with a lens of intersectionality. I think it's very important. Unfortunately, like media, again, like as I was talking about, bias is also like a caste bias, and not bias, but like there's like a lopsided representation of, like people of certain caste backgrounds in media. It's mostly upper caste people. I am one of them. I belong to an upper caste community. So I think like it's incredibly important for journalists to look at any news, be it politics, be it like conflict, like religious extremism. They need to look at with a lens of intersectionality, because in India, it's a part of our like identity politics.
It's interesting how just by being on the other side of the spectrum, you sort of have no view of any of these discrimination that happens.
Like discrimination doesn't have to be like, we also live in a modern society. So discrimination has also evolved accordingly. Everything is subtle. Like you don't.
Yeah, that's true.
Even I won't realize it, but everything is subtle. And again, like all these microaggressions and all that we feel as a part of life is actually not. And yeah, there are just like really small things. And again, like, like women, especially of like minority backgrounds, like Muslim women, for example, Dalit women, trans women. So, like the more you look at gender with the lens of intersectionality, like the marginalization gets more acute. So that's like the sad reality. And then the fact that, like discrimination has become like, I mean, it's always brazen everywhere, but it's also become very subtle. It's become more evolved. And yeah, that's why I feel that it's, I mean, like, it's not just, like looking at these issues with intersectionality, but we should also like, I mean, Indian media has this major problem of like not hiring more people from diverse backgrounds. And like, unfortunately, it's an echo chamber. So I still feel that, like representation, like stories will never be authentic if, like, for example, if I am, like doing a story on a Muslim community, Indian Muslim community, I will still be looking at them as subjects rather than, like as somebody from the community. And my story will never be as authentic as somebody who comes from that community. It will never be as authentic. So I feel like Indian media industry really needs to address this problem, because no matter how hard they try, like they'll like have like all these discussions on like minority issues. I mean, you know what a manel is, right? We'll have like, panel discussions on like women's issues and stuff, and all the panelists will be men. So, it's the same sort of like situation.
How do you think journalists can contribute to solving the ongoing polarization right now?
Oh man, I think a lot of media is actually contributing to it right now, which is sad. I mean, so like India's like just like any other country, there's always been like two sides of the story driven by two different like types of media supported by two different states. But in India, as in like right now, yes, of course, there is this depolarization. Incidentally, I'm doing a report on media bias, so I'm reading a lot of like history of like media bias in Indian like news coverage, news channels, newsroom behaviors, and stuff like that. And so, like, media bias, as in, like, this polarization has existed, like, from before the independent, even when we didn't have, like, news TV channels. But India's always had, like, these, like, propaganda sort of news outlets. And before independence, I guess a lot of these, like, national, like, these nationalist sort of newsletters or like news outlets, they also came up as a response to British colonization. Obviously they took a really different shape after, during, as in like before, during, and after India gained independence. But what we see right now, obviously, like as you said, right, this guy became like, he was radicalized by like a certain kind of media that he consumed. And we see that like there are like like social media surveys and like reports that platforms, I mean, like these tech platforms contribute a lot to this polarization and bias. I mean, a lot of reporting that we're doing, that a lot of like independent news media is doing, is also like they're holding accountable these tech companies like Meta, yeah, like mostly Meta, Twitter, where there are, like there are studies that show that Meta, YouTube, and like, I don't know about Twitter, but like, yeah, majority of Indians use Facebook and YouTube. Like there are studies that show that, like these platforms, like they are designed in a way where they fuel bias, according to, like that country's majoritarian status. And you see, and they also, like, this is also like a big problem with tech companies, like their policies in the global south, they're next to nothing. They don't give a shit about what happens in the country. They've literally like like they've led to like genocide in like different like global south countries. They don't own up to it. They have admitted, like, I think like there was, what is that, Cambridge Analytica, whatever that whole thing was. That was proof that these tech companies, they are there to back, like majoritarian governments. They are there to like fuel bias. They're there to like polarize the people. So there is proof that these tech platforms are a big reason why this polarization happens. And obviously, like in today's landscape, a lot of media coverage that you see, like they are, I mean, a lot of them are like pro-state. So it is inevitable. And a lot of like, there is no, like media literacy or digital literacy in India, unfortunately. There is very little, and you only find it in urban spaces. So, like I'm from Dehradun. I mean, a lot of my own family members, they consume that kind of like polarized sort of media and news. This is all they see on their YouTube and Facebook, like this kind of content. If, for example, some communal conflict has erupted in the outskirts of Gurgaon in Nu and Mewat, for example, like this incident that came out, what they'll hear will be some other version of the news event. They will not hear both the sides. And I guess it's also the same for, like a lot of us, for example, like it takes a lot of effort for journalists to like go to the ground and find out what exactly happened, because there is so much misinformation, so much polarizing news on social media, on YouTube, WhatsApp forward. So I'd say, like, I don't know how, I mean, like media, there are some media organizations that are doing a lot. Alt News is one that's been doing a lot in terms of misinformation and disinformation, especially when it comes to, like religious extremism, like, because a lot of fake media is circulated whenever, like something of communal nature erupts in the country. So media does have the power, but I would say that right now, majority of like pro-state media, like they're doing the actual opposite. And I mean, unfortunately, right now, majority of people have bought into that narrative. I don't know if it's too late. I don't know. I think like we'll just have to see in the next couple of years, post 2024, I guess. But yeah, I think it's. I don't know. I'm just being a pessimist. I think it's a little too late for the media. I mean, there are like media organizations that are doing a lot of good stuff, but I still feel it's like a drop in the ocean.
Do you think we can sort of nudge journalists to have journalistic integrity?
I mean, I think like the media industry is a little different because, I mean, integrity is secondary. But like journalists in India, like most journalists in India, like we're also like an audience-hungry sort of individuals. We're sort of audience-hungry business people. I don't know how to respond to that. Because I mean, like a lot of journalism is driven by other, like factors such as TRP and funding and stuff like that. So you're saying that this is how you can like, like impact like journalists' behavior or like approach to journalism. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, of course. So basically, you just keep like the honey at one place, at the right places. That's the whole thing, and you basically attract the bees. So it's basically like what you do is and this is a very sort of passive way of turning systems around. So can we find a space where maintaining integrity is profitable? Something like that. Yeah.
I don't think integrity is profitable. Again, I'm sorry. I'm just a big, I'm just a pessimist. I think like, also in India, like as you see from Press Freedom Index reports and stuff like that, it's also, India has a very like tightly controlled sort of media. The government has an eye on everything. What is news for journalists can be very different from like what the government considers news or what they want to be consumed as news. So yeah, I guess like I don't know, like I'm just like pessimist when it comes to like changing like all of like this very intrinsic thing about journalism, about integrity, because honestly like I think like ultimately it's the money that matters the most. And journalism is like, like a lot of journalists are in it for the power of it. Like information is power, right? So, I don't know, but I don't know, like, I don't.
Yeah, that's fine. That's just, even I don't know. It's just one of those things that I was reading and I thought it could be applied here. But I understand like it's pretty, it's a network that's pretty interconnected, a lot of things. So, there was something, as complicated as that, probably, something like this won't work. So now what we can do is like, we can quickly go through some of your pieces of work. And I was thinking, let's go geographically across South Asia. So the first piece that I have right here is the fall of the Sri Lankan government. You can just, touch upon this topic and also give us a larger story about the country.
Sure. So I've never, I'd never been to Sri Lanka until last year when the mass anti-government protests erupted. And what I found interesting, and also like something that's common across the world when it comes to government, is the corruption of it. Like this extremely wealthy and powerful family that's basically been, like the ruling family of Sri Lanka for decades, like from the beginning, like 70s, 80s or something. So, so when I went to Sri Lanka, I, like learned through that story, I learned a lot about majoritarian politics. It's Sinhalese Buddhist majority country. it has a problem of corruption, which is there. Like it's a universal theme. But also, like this story allowed me to look into why, despite this track record of corruption and all of that, like why the people kept voting for him. Like there's like this deep history of, again, polarization, marginalization of minority communities, majoritarian politics. So I found all of that really interesting as a background, and then talk about, like the allegations, for example, of each of their family members being involved in, for example, like putting money in like offshore accounts at a time when most of the countries below the poverty line. So yeah, like last year when I went to Sri Lanka, and like I'd never been to Sri Lanka before that, even for tourism, especially for tourism. So I found it incredibly sad that such a beautiful country, which shares a very similar sort of colonial setup as similar what, like same colonial setup as India, and which is like suffering this aftermath of colonization, because corruption is like sort of like a lane and vein of colonization. So it was that was like that one story I did from Sri Lanka, and through that story I was able to also like I did that story on the Rajapaksas and how corrupt they are, and how they essentially like people accuse them of like selling off their country and making them poor. But through that story, I was able to also travel to the north and look at that economic crisis from the lens of the Tamil minority in North Sri Lanka. So that was also really interesting. And in that story also, like I added that intersection of gender, because a lot of resistance, like historical resistance against this particular family, like before the Sinhalese majority people realized that this government is up to no good, the Tamil minority people have always been saying that, listen, this government is off. So I was able to tell the story of this anti-government protest from the lens of minority Tamil population, especially the women who have been leading that movement for over a decade.
The second story is about the Tibetan pop star who set himself on fire. Yeah, I would like to know, how does this relate to the larger story happening in the country as well?
Yeah, so I came across this story as in like I saw like photos of protests in the US by like different Tibetan communities, refugees living there. And I was intrigued by this guy, like I honestly, like I spent a day watching his music video. So Sevang Norbu is his name. He was like this young rising Tibetan pop star. He was a huge hit in, like, he traveled to like Beijing to take part in these Chinese pop contests, pop like music contests and stuff. And what I found interesting was that, like for years, like in his formative years as a musician, he was the classic example of Chinese assimilation. Like Tibet was invaded in the 1950s, and a lot of people, a lot of Tibetans have had to like assimilate, or like being forced to assimilate in, like in Chinese politics and society. So I found it interesting that this poster boy of Chinese assimilation, like one day just went to, what is that place where, which is, wait, let me open that article. I wrote it like last year, but he went to, sorry, give me 1 second. Potala Palace. He went to Potala Palace, which is known for being, like this protest site for Tibetans. This is where a lot of Tibetans have immolated themselves. And I found it interesting that, like this guy who's like the, like everyone loves him, like Tibetan or Chinese. And one day he just goes and like immolates himself. As in, like, there are reports of him immolating. And his body then disappears. Like, nobody actually knows whether he's dead or alive. Most Tibetans think that he's dead. The Chinese officials haven't confirmed whether he's dead or alive. But yeah, like just through the conversations with Tibetan diaspora living in the US, living in India, and a lot of them had, like they'd been seeing this guy's music coming up, and just like him inadvertently becoming a symbol of protest in such a tightly controlled, like Chinese controlled Tibet. So I just thought that would make for a really compelling story, and also like put a spotlight on Tibet, which is again like not really covered by international media unless some shit happens.
By the way, are Indian journalists allowed to go to China?
Yeah, they are, but I think like over the last 1 year, China has expelled. I think like a couple of months ago, they expelled the last two Indian journalists. Last two Indian journalists covering China from Beijing. So there is, I didn't travel to China for this because this would mostly mean going to Tibet, which is very controlled. A lot of, it's also, as journalists, we also have to think about the risks we pose on community. It's very easy for us to, sit from a distance and report on communities that are persecuted. But you're like going to those communities and their homes and, essentially putting a spotlight on them, that would risk their, life in Tibet. So I was also like extremely conscious of that. I spoke to people who are safe and who are, also vocal about the Tibetan issues and like people who would not be under threat. So I had to be conscious of that. So I decided to do the story by piecing this whole thing together through the experiences and theories and like stories of Tibetans, but like Tibetans who are not under threat, like Tibetans who are like living outside of China, who are in safer places.
The next one is about ISI giving its first press conference in the aftermath of this Pakistani journalist who got assassinated in Kenya. And the Kenyan authorities basically went on to say that it was a case of mistaken identity.
So I wrote one news analysis on the ISI giving their first press conference in the entire history. I found that extremely interesting because, as Indians, like as also like their neighbors, like apart from the geopolitical repercussions of it, as Indians, we've grown up with a very lopsided idea of what the ISI is. And, like in Bollywood, like there is a certain representation of the ISI. And I work with happen to, like with Vice, I worked with journalists who are from Pakistan, based in Pakistan. And I would, we would often like talk about like all the misrepresentations in our respective medias about like certain things in our country, which is essentially like propaganda. So I saw this ISI press conference on Twitter, and I found it really interesting because it looked like a bunch of Sarkari guys who were like essentially, and it's all connected to the Imran Khan news, like he recently got arrested. But Imran Khan at that point was making some really bold accusations against the ISI. So in Pakistan, it's it's very difficult, not difficult, but like it's a very interesting politics. So the ISI has been responsible in installing and dismantling governments over there. Like it's an open secret. Everyone knows about it. But for years, like the military and the ISI, they've gone unquestioned. Like nobody questions them. And if somebody does, there's a coup and, like there's military dictatorship. So I found this specific, again, like this article was a response to a news break that the ISI has given a press conference for the first time in history. And I just, through that story, I was able to like talk about the, how controlled Pakistan's government is, like especially by the military and the ISI. And personally, I was just a little amused because they just like looked like a bunch of Sarkari men, which is not what you see in Bollywood or like popular representation in India. Sorry, what was the other piece?
No, the piece was basically, I wanted to know, like, I thought so there was this journalist who was pro Imran Khan, and I think he left for Kenya because I think he felt threatened in his own country, and then he got assassinated by the Kenyan officials, who then declared it to be a mistaken identity case.
Yeah. I wrote that. I need to. Yeah, he was anti-government. Yeah, he was a really, so I like the one of the editors that I was working with, she had actually worked with him. He's like this really famous, respected journalist, Arshad Sharif. Like in his 50s, everyone knows him. And like just like in India, there is a cost of covering news from, like if like even if it doesn't agree with the government. So yeah, like he basically ran off to Kenya because he knew that his life was under threat. He was told that his life was under threat. And in Kenya also, like he died, he was killed under very like mysterious circumstances, where the Kenyan authorities basically said that, oh, like, oops, sorry, mistake. But obviously, like the journalist fraternity in Pakistan were like, like obviously this is politically motivated assassination. So it was interesting. I spoke to a bunch of Pakistani journalists about it. There was a lot of like stuff on Kenyan and Pakistani media about this. So it was sad to see something so similar happening in India, in Pakistan. So it was a part of my coverage on like press freedom across South Asia.
So do you think this particular incident that happened led to the ISI giving its first press conference?
No, it wasn't this. So essentially, when this dude died, Imran Khan, again, like he accused the military and the ISI of like wrongdoing. Like this was one of the many things. And like this was one of the reasons why the ISI gave that press statement. It wasn't specifically about this. This was one of the things that was mentioned, because Imran Khan also like made a lot of accusations in terms of some leaked conversations and stuff like that, like a lot of other stuff. But yeah, this was one of it. Like Imran Khan did make like a lot of like bold accusations, including the fact that these guys got the journalist killed.
The next one is about the Bangladeshi mother who did this cover up.
Actually got a lot of interest from like random American like production houses to turn this into a film.
It does look like a film story. It is.
Like when I came across this, the story was already like 1 week old. And it was really interesting. Like I collaborated with a Bangladeshi journalist for this, obviously, because, like language was this huge problem, access on such a short notice. But this journalist that I was collaborating with, he actually tracked down the family and interviewed the mother and the daughter. The daughter, I think she was a minor at that point. But like when I came across the story, I was just like, dude, this is like a Hollywood or even Bollywood film in the making. And, like this is absolutely wild. Like a mother trafficking herself through the same route as her daughter. And then finding her like after a year, like having gone through all that shit as a trafficked woman, like it was insane. And they still live, like when that journalist had interviewed her, they still didn't feel safe because they had come back home, but all these traffickers knew that, okay, like this. And through like once she got her daughter back, they went back to the border, they got caught, and like inadvertently, like by getting caught, they also exposed like this whole transnational trafficking ring. So it wasn't just like her rescuing her daughter, she just like outed a whole bunch of trafficking network in India, like across the Indian Bangladesh border. So it was pretty wild. I got a lot of emails and like requests to turn this into a film, but unfortunately, like I was a full-time employee of Vice, so technically Vice owns the story. Yeah, I didn't own the story, so I couldn't just give my word for it. Otherwise, yeah, I would have definitely sold it to people.
This is the last one. This is from India. This is, I think, your most famous sort of piece. This is the Lal Bihari case, where he was basically, uh, branded as dead, and for I don't know how many, for the last 30 plus years. And he had to go through this entire bureaucracy to prove that he's alive.
So I had come across Lal Bihari Mritak's case like years ago and like during some research, and I just I knew about his case. I also knew that there were like these isolated other cases, and I've been following his work since then. Like he has helped over 300 people who were wrongfully declared dead go back to being like not dead in government records. So this story was covered actually the first time in the 90s by Time magazine, and then it was like independent media and all, they covered it like on and off. But I realized that a lot of coverage, like this is a pretty unique crime, like when you look at it from an outsider's perspective, this is a very like interesting crime because especially for, somebody who works with the global media, like my editors were fascinated. They were just like, what the hell? How can this even happen? And in India, like we get a little desensitized by all these unique crimes that we see almost every day. So there is a lot of like global interest in, like crime in South Asia. So I decided to explore this. I knew about Lal Bihari's case, like in the 80s, a relative of his basically allegedly bribed a government official and like a revenue records official. And when Mr. Lal Bihari, when he went in the 90s to ask for a loan, in the 80s to ask for a loan, this guy was like, oh, dude, you've been declared dead. I mean, you're not even alive. How can we give you a loan? And Mr. Lal Bihari was a little interesting. He comes from a Dalit background. Majority of Dalits do not have access to land anyway, but touchwood, like he had access to some family land. And he wanted to use that to get a loan in order to, and he also comes from like this part of Varanasi, and Varanasi is known for its Varanasi Banaras silk. So he's a craftsman, like he used to like spin silk and like he used to like make Banarasi saris. He wanted to open his own like loom unit or something, and that's what he needed a loan for. So this is a guy who comes from like generational poverty from one of the most like backward communities in the country. And he's trying to get out of that generational poverty by creating a business, and then he's deprived of that. So that was a little bit of background. And through this, like crime that is very like ingenious, and also, like it's also like family dispute, some that sort of an angle. So Lal Bihari's story interested him because he fought for some 20 years until he was declared alive. And even now, like it's not like his original birth certificate has been revived. Like the day he was declared alive, that's the date of his birth certificate too. So even though he's in his 70s, technically he's in his 20s, like according to his birth certificate. And more than that, like he didn't just fight that battle for himself. He fought it for like hundreds of others. Like when his case started being covered by national media or international media, there were a lot of people who had gone through the same ordeal. And it became, like it was surprising or shocking that so many other people went through the same, but didn't get the coverage that Lal Bihari got. So yeah, it took him like some 20 years to get himself declared alive. And obviously, like you can't get this shit done through traditional means, like by just being nice about it. So he was extremely theatrical and dramatic about it because he's, like he's declared dead, so he had nothing to lose. And so his like one of his ways to like really grab attention was to get a police complaint against him, because even if there's like a criminal record of him, that still proves that he's alive. So he was willing to go to any lengths to make himself be declared alive. I found like those memes also pretty interesting, and sort of sad that, like you have to go through such lens. And then of course, like through him, a lot more other cases came to light. And I went to UP and like we found like 4 such subjects. And yeah, so yeah, just like that was my story. And of course, like I like through my reporting, I also realized that a lot of reporting over the last 20-30 years has been on the uniqueness of the crime and how crazy it is, but not on like why it happens. So through this story, I was able to like talk about India's colonial land laws, also like land laws, and like how it disproportionately excludes certain communities like the Dalit community, women, especially if they're widows or like people with disabilities. So like I was able to explore all that entire like background of it and talk to government officials. Yeah, so that's what I did.
Any escapades or like any danger that you encountered during your journalistic career? Any life-threatening?
Yeah, not life-threatening, touch wood. It's not come to that yet, although it is extremely common. Like there are a lot more brave journalists who cover like communal aftermath of communal rights, and like there's a lot of shit that happens. Like the only challenging time that I can think of right now is when I went to Sri Lanka and I was going to North Sri Lanka. That's where the Tamil minority population is concentrated. This is also like during the civil war that ended in 2009. Yeah, the civil war ended in 2009 in Sri Lanka. So that was also, I went to a point where essentially the Sri Lankan state and Sri Lankan military, that was the last place where they bombed and essentially crushed the Tamil sort of independence movement. So I was traveling from Colombo to North Sri Lanka, and I've heard a lot. Like, so basically it's, I mean, not to like sound crude, but North Sri Lanka is essentially the Kashmir of Sri Lanka, and it is incredibly surveilled. When I went there, I was going alone. A lot of journalists usually go with, like human rights people, or a lot of Tamil journalists are constantly under scrutiny. So I went there were like some 9 checkposts. There was absolutely no lighting. There were literally like military posts hidden behind trees and shrubs. So I was like, my car was stopped like 2-3 times. I'd taken like a normal cab. My cab driver was like this commercial driver who was a Sinhalese guy, and he kept saying, this is a wrong part of the town. You should not be here. I don't want to be here. I was like, dude, listen, I'm paying you now. You have to take me there. But anyway, I went through like 3 rounds of security check where they opened my suitcase, like went through my clothes. I was covering essentially this day that they commemorate as Genocide Day, because that was the day when that area was bombed, when the military was trying to crush the independence movement. And there were like drones everywhere. And so this local journalist who was helping me out, he came to me and he was like, listen, there are photos of you being circulated apparently in the military circles. Asking local journalists, who is this person, where is she come from, where is she going next, who is she meeting. So there was a certain pressure on local people who I was in touch with, who I was meeting, to like basically be accountable for my activities. So that was a little scary, because touch wood, like even though I wasn't like in constant like under direct threat, my activities, I was being monitored. Somebody had taken like random photos of me, and like there was circulating. I received a copy of that photo, very unflattering one, and I got a little freaked out. I basically like finished my interviews in a day and a half, and I just left. I was just like really freaked. That's what, again, like that's not really extremely crazy, but as somebody who comes from, like a privileged sort of position in India, like I'd never experienced that kind of surveillance. Of course, like I need a lot of like journalists from like Kashmiri journalists or Muslim journalists in India who go through this kind of surveillance every other day. So, and they're like, yeah, they're, I guess, like more stronger than I am. But yeah, like this is like the most adventurous part of my journey. And I think the other one would be like I went to this Sharia regulated province in Indonesia to do a story on an all women Sharia like flogging squad. It was interesting. Like I got like some incredible access to interview these women floggers because this is the first time in the world where, you know, like the Sharia regulated region has like given the job of a man to women. And the job was to like flog only women because apparently like a man's flogging is too harsh on women. So yeah, so I was like looking into like the gender aspect of it, like whether these kind of punishments really have any like impact on gendered violence in the Indonesian province. But over there, like I was I was basically like I was in my jeans, and even though like my head and all was covered, they usually they don't say anything to journalists. But yeah, I was told to like change into like a full body thing. Like a Sharia policewoman came to me and she was like pointing at my face and like jeans, and she was just like, she told my translator, what is she wearing? Ask her to wear something full. And that was the first time I experienced, I guess, some kind of, like censorship in terms of clothing. So that was new, but, when in Rome, so I just I went and bought like a full body thing. And yeah, then the police was much more welcoming after that.
How much of your ideals still prevails today from the time you started your journalistic career?
Not much. I joined journalism with a lot of idealism. Like most journalists, we think our words will change the world. For most of us, it doesn't. I mean, like it does. I mean, there is some appreciation, but like with overtime, it's also important to become introspective. Like as journalists, like me, like personally, I entered this field thinking, I put this field on a pedestal in like lots of ways. And that made me blind. Like I know the power of journalism. I appreciate the field. Like a lot of international journalists have done incredible reporting. It's very important for these stories to come out. But I think with me, I've also it's like my time in this field has also made me very introspective about the business of journalism. As you can see, like a lot of media outlets are shutting down. Vice News Asia Pacific, which I was a part of, they shut down a couple of months ago. I don't work with them anymore because they don't have any Asia Pacific newsroom anymore. So I've become I think it's very important to, sort of reflect internally and look at the problems of journalism, I guess. Look at the lack of representation, look at the business model. It is so flawed. It's not a very sustainable model, ultimately journalism is a business. So I guess when I entered the field, I was way more idealistic about the impact it's making. But what I didn't think about is how fair is the industry to journalists. Like journalism is built upon, our stories. And I don't think it's fair to the journalists themselves. There's a major problem of global pay parities. The journalists in global south, they face far greater risks than in the global north. And I feel that even global media, they acknowledge the risks, but they don't do much. So I'm even though I joined this field with a lot of idealism, I am at this point, I have a lot of criticisms about it, and all of them are well-founded. But yeah, I do feel there is still a lot of idealism, but I guess it's balance of idealism and self-reflection and criticism.
Do you think if I repeat something for a long enough time, it sort of becomes the truth? This is something that's becoming very prevalent since the advent of social media, where, something is being repeated it could probably be the truth, probably be lies. But if something's being repeated again and again online on social media and it's thrown at you every other day, it sort of seeps into your mind and you sort of start believing it.
I mean, that's how the post-truth came to be, right? By repeating a narrative, irrespective of its truth or irrespective of its leanings, to an audience. And again, like this speaks of the lack of digital and media literacy in our society. Like, unfortunately, whatever we see out there, whatever we see online, we tend to believe it. So yeah, there is some truth. I guess like that's how like a lot of like bias and stigmas and dogmas in our societies are built, right? Like by repeating a stereotype, by repeating a narrative. So yeah, there is some truth in it, and like it's yeah, I mean it's there in the.
Do you think journalists can help people break out of this?
I think a big blame should be taken by tech platforms, because that's where all the shit is happening. I think like media, as journalists and as media organization, we need to hold them more accountable than we do, because that's where the, like they're also like, there is a means to like disperse all this kind of information, and tech platforms essentially fuel this kind of narrative. Like any kind of narrative, tech platforms play a major role. I think like, and it happens, I mean, it's happening right now. It's been happening for a while. Media organizations are collaborating with tech platforms in order to make information more fair, more objective, putting prompts, as you said, like below certain news that, as in like a lot of media outlets actually, like whenever they publish, for example, like an agency copy, about a certain event, they like put like a disclaimer that they did not independently report it. They have just collaborated, as in like they've just like taken information from an agency report, and that they cannot verify most of the things that are mentioned. So I think these kind of disclaimers are there. But again, like there is so much like, like lack of awareness in people, where they would read, like a lot of people just like take information by face value, right? Like they'll read the headline and for them that's a story. And that also speaks of the lack of media literacy that I was talking about. Like a lot of people, headline is the story, and for media organization, headline is the clickbait. So that it's like a vicious cycle. Like the readers want that, the media people rely on that for their revenues. So it's like a vicious cycle. And to break out of it, I guess media organizations need to be held accountable, which doesn't happen. Like we don't have like a very strong media advisory sort of organization, or like an independent one, not like a state one. We don't have a very strong media sort of body that holds its own industry accountable. And of course, like our tech platforms are doing bare minimum. So I think like the only way to break out of it is to it's for these two sort of fields to be held accountable. And I guess like this has to come from people, man. Like they're like, people have to like consciously understand whether, like whether rifts are like, who's responsible for these rifts in our society.
What's your take on objective truth? Do you think, is there something like an objective truth?
Yeah. If the truth is coming from an institute, I mean, I think everybody comes with their own, like one thing that we don't learn in India, like in journalism, is addressing your own biases, which I've learned a lot at Vice News, like by working with, like editors outside of my country. Like in India, I found it very difficult to separate personal bias, or like, like basically like a personal perception on like certain communities or events or anything from the truth. So I do feel that, like, firstly, I don't think that most media organizations operate with the purpose of objectivity. I think there is always like a certain bias coloring, like their perspective of the truth. I honestly like, it's a little contested. I honestly like, it's just my own opinion. I don't think there is an objective truth in today's time. I think there's always bias, and yeah. yeah, that's just my personal opinion.
How do you think we can get a buy-in from governments on journalistic freedom? How can we come to a middle ground here? By middle ground, I mean a space where institutions don't feel like threatened, uh, and also on the other hand, journalists have enough freedom to criticize.
I think like government, as in like the state and journalistic freedom, two completely different directions. Because for a state, media is, like it's supposed to be the mouthpiece. But I think like, and I'm a little pessimistic. I think we're very far from, like there being a middle ground for the state and the journalistic community. Yeah, again, like I'm a pessimist, so like I do feel that we're very far from that reality. However, we also need to like take into account like a lot of our systems and these structures that you're talking about, they've been installed by a colonial system, where all like media, for example, was created to be the mouthpiece of a colonial regime. And that system, like in the independent India has inherited that system, and very little has happened in terms of like modernizing it. So yes, we, even if we look at, like for example, the press freedom in the US, where there is like far greater freedom for journalists to operate and to publish their reports, and like they speak, like with, I guess, like less risks than journalists from the global south. But yeah, like I and yeah, of course, like the US also has like its own history of colonization. But I think like in India, we have, like in South Asia in general, we have inherited colonial structures. And I think like that inherently makes like this kind of reality, like this middle ground between like the government and journalistic freedom. I find it like it hampering that sort of progress. So I think like we do need to look at the past and see how we're still hanging on to certain colonial laws, colonial structures, which absolutely have no place in our modern society, our modern context. So yeah, I think we're still far from that middle ground, and I think we need to like take into account like this colonial history, which is still very much a part of our lives. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
No, it does. It does. It does. So you're basically saying that we have still stuck to colonial systems, and we haven't really thought about how to change them to the new age, right?
We haven't, and we haven't addressed, like inequalities, like deeper. Like, for example, I think like journalism itself needs to contend with a lot of inequalities within its own system, like caste, for example. I mean, it's also like just like just like a government, journalism follows the same structure. It's upper caste dominated. I mean, there is an inherent inequality within the journalistic space. So I think it's very difficult for an institute like the fourth estate, as they say, to, like address like the larger inequality when it itself is inherently flawed. I'm not saying that it's a huge hindrance, but I mean, there is a lack of, like representation. And I feel that a lot of challenges within the Institute of Journalism makes it incapable of, like sort of, fighting like the larger inequalities in our country.
Okay, final question. How do you think the AI age is going to impact journalism? We are right now seeing like a trend where people are, following newsletters more than newspapers, which basically means they're following individual journalists like a Faye D'Souza. Do you think this is where we are heading?
I mean, yeah, deepfakes and stuff has definitely made the job of journalists more difficult. It's become, obviously, like you can always, like a seasoned journalist will always be able to differentiate between, like a doctored image or video and an actual video and image, which we've seen in over the last few years. We've seen like certain governments that I would not name using deep fake to make like political videos. We've seen like AI being used to doctor images of protesters who are protesting against certain like government officials. But AI being used in newsrooms, I don't know. Personally, I'm optimistic. First of all, I don't think AI can replace journalism. I know there's like a lot of talk about like AI replacing journalism, but AI, one has to, as you said, right, it comes with its own biases. It cannot be relied upon when it comes to factual accuracies. AI is also like, since it's been developed by the West, it has a very limited understanding of issues or ideas from the global South. Like there are like all these inherent issues. I do feel as a journalist, and knowing how little journalists are paid generally, especially in India, I do feel that AI would give a lot of help to journalists. I see it as a positive way. I think it'll, definitely create shortcuts for journalists. I don't see AI replacing journalism, to be honest. I mean, no. Like AI might replace certain activities, but it can't replace, like actual storytellers, like people who do like real work of journalists, like editors, producers. It can fill up certain gaps, but I honestly see it as a positive thing. I think it can be used in a positive way. Yeah, like making things easier for journalists.
Do you think, are we going to follow more individual journalists on their social media, Substack, etc.? And do you think that's how I really feel it's going to help journalists? I really feel that it's going to give more revenue channels, if nothing else.
I mean, I think in journalism, it's always been there, right? Like, it's always like a very, like, individuals turn themselves into brands in journalism. I mean, you've seen it with like Barkha Datta and all, like these guys are more celebrities than journalists. So I think it's always existed. But I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think AI would help push people towards these personality-driven journalists. I can't speak more about like their credibility, but definitely, like it also like it'll require journalists to like really step it up in terms of their personal branding. But I think it's always a good thing. I mean, yeah, it's always good to have a challenge.